Right, okay, well, it's a couple of minutes past 10, so I think we'll just make a start. So what we're going to do this morning, so the structure of the morning is going to look like, well, first we're going to start with a little bit of ritual where we're going to invoke Avalokiteshvara, who holds the Bodhicitta, to his heart, and sit for a couple of minutes, and then I am going to give a talk, and then we're going to have a tea break, and then we're going to have groups, and then it will be 12:30. So that's what it's looking like at the moment. So yeah, so we're going to in unison salute the shrine together in a minute, but let's just evoke what it is we're saluting here. So it's probably, don't know how much you can see, but we've got both a tanka of the four-armed Avalokiteshvara and a rupa. And in a way, like all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, like all these archetypal forms, they are symbols of the Bodhicitta. And they're more than symbols of the Bodhicitta. It's like they're sort of embodiments where it's like Bodhicitta is just wanting to communicate with us and just wanting to kind of say, look, it's like this, it's like this, have you got it yet? And they're just kind of trying to express that with so much compassion and so much kind of wanting us to be well and wanting us to break out of our limitations. And just the forms themselves are directly trying to communicate what Bodhicitta is in the image, in this embodiment of a human being. So with Avalokiteshvara, this four-armed version, we've got the hands, the two inner hands of Avalokiteshvara, and he's holding the Bodhicitta to his heart. He's holding this jewel of what is most precious in the whole of the world to his heart. And imagine what our lives would be if we lived with what was most precious to us, with this, this conjoining of wisdom and compassion, and we never lost it. We always held it to our heart. And then with his two outer arms, well, on the right, he's holding a mala and he's going through his mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. And a mala is a never-ending circle. So you never get to the end of this sort of activity of saving beings. And at the same time, it's wedded to devotion. And then on his left-hand side, which is the wisdom side, he's holding this lotus in bloom. And it's like he's saying he's just offering this lotus and saying, this is our potential. You too could bloom like that lotus. Look, it's here. It's like this. Can you open like this lotus? So now what we're going to do is we're going to salute the three jewels in the person of Avalokiteshvara. And then when we come back and sit down again, I'm going to do a reading from the Bodhicharya Avatara, which is just very poetic about the Bodhicitta. And then we're going to chant to Avalokiteshvara. Okay. So in unison. Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dhammaya, Namo Sanghaya, Namo Namah. Home. Today my birth is fruitful. My human life is justified. Today I am born into the family of the Buddha. Now I am the Buddha's child. So that there may be no blemish upon this spotless family, I must now act as becomes my family. As a blind man might find a jewel in heaps of rubbish, so too this awakening mind has somehow appeared in me. This is the elixir of life, born to end death in the world. This is the inexhaustible treasure, alleviating poverty in the world. This is the supreme medicine, curing the sickness of the world. A tree of shelter for weary creatures staggering along the road of existence. The causeway to cross over bad rebirths, open to all who travel. It is the rising moon of the mind, mitigating the defilements of the world. It is the brilliant sun, dispelling the mist of ignorance from the world. It is the fresh butter, risen up from churning the milk of the true Dhamma. For the caravan of humanity travelling the road of existence, hungry for the enjoyment of happiness. This is a feast of happiness, offered as refreshment to all beings who approach. Today I summon the world to Buddhahood and to worldly happiness meanwhile. In the presence of all the Buddhas, may gods, titans, and all rejoice. Om Mani Padme Hum, 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 Om Just sitting for a couple of minutes. So now do get yourselves comfortable to listen to me talk about bodhicitta, and don't feel like you need to look at the screen. If you want to lie down or you want to look out of the window or something like that, you just put yourself in whatever posture will suit you best. So we call this weekend Moon of the Mind, Bodhicitta. The snag of starting with some ritual is that I then go slightly non-conceptual, and then I've got to give a talk, and then that's problematic. But I'm sure that'll all happen okay. So yeah, we're going to look first at, well, what is bodhicitta? And then we're going to look at, well, how do we approach it? How do we invite bodhicitta to arise in us? What are the principles behind how that happens? And what are particular practices or approaches that we could take? Yes. So we just heard that very poetic kind of outpouring that Shantideva gives us about, like, and the bodhicitta's so amazing, and it's like I found a jewel in heaps of rubbish. No way, how did that happen? And then he just goes through all these different poetic similes about an elixir, a supreme medicine, the sun, the moon, that the moon comes out in darkness and sheds its light from darkness. A tree of shelter, the fresh butter. I particularly like the fresh butter. And I find it quite interesting that, the Bodhicharyavatara is a text that I love very much. It's very dear to me. And, Shantideva, he's just so passionate, and you can tell that his heart is in what he's writing. And he's also got this real kind of wisdom clarity. So he's very much embodying the qualities of Bodhicitta. And yet, in all the chapters of that book, he never gives you a neat and concise definition of what bodhicitta is. He's forever talking about the awakening mind and how amazing it is and how wonderful it is. But he, in a way, he leaves us to approach that through, well, these are the practices. This is what you need to do. And then all this poetry and simile, and it's like, oh, and your heart can approach it like this. Because actually it is quite a tricky area to talk about. But we're going to have a go anyway. So let's do some facts. Maitrisiddhi gave us a bit of an introduction last night. So we've got this term, Bodhicitta, Bodhi being awakening, enlightenment, Buddhahood. And then Chitta, heart, mind. So it's like united the whole of our emotional and rational beings, all of us integrated in awakening, or in the pursuit of awakening. And it's like there's different ways, there's different phrases we can use to translate bodhicitta, and just notice, well, which ones do you respond to? So we've got the awakening mind, the mind in process of awakening, which in a sense, like, well, that's all of us. Or the awakening heart, the enlightening heart. So like our heart that's just opening to the world beyond the self and other divide. It's interesting, actually, I had Andrea and Carolyn were here at Taraloka doing some gardening last week, and I was going around saying, what does the bodhicitta mean to you? And I can't actually remember what Andrea and Carolyn said, but what was really obvious was it really meant something about their hearts, and they both started putting their hands at their hearts and then opening their arms like this, and it was like sort of doing this physical expression of expanding and opening into the world. It was very, very beautiful, actually. It sort of slightly looked like they were going to take off, but luckily they stuck around and did some gardening. So that's the awakening heart. And then Bhante translates it as the will to enlightenment, which has quite a different flavour, doesn't it? But it's bringing out this aspect of bodhicitta, of volition, of wanting, of, like longing for enlightenment, just like volitions that are arising within us that just want enlightenment to happen, whether that's within us or within other beings. It's just like this sort of, this stream, this kind of, flow of conditionality that just wants awakening to manifest in living beings. So bodhicitta, this is a term from the Mahayana, that great wave of spiritual practice that renewed the Buddhist tradition a few hundred years after the Buddha's death. And it re-emphasised the compassionate aspect of the Buddhist path, and also this mythic, magical nature of practice. So in that tradition, a bodhisattva is someone practicing to become fully and completely enlightened, totally liberated, heart, mind, completely free. And that is for their own sake, and it is also for the sake of other beings. And our Triratna Buddhist order, that's so much part of that Mahayana tradition. So, So all of us, we're either ordained or else we are training for ordination. And this aspect, it's embodied in 2 of the 4 ordination vows. So on ordination, for the attainment of enlightenment, I accept this ordination. For the sake of all beings, I accept this ordination. So it's like, in a way, that's what our movement is doing in the world. Like, for the sake of enlightenment, may this enlightening force arise in beings. May beings become free. May we become free. May as many beings as possible become free. It's what this order is about. So a bodhisattva in the fullest sense is more than somebody with good intentions, sincerely practicing the Dharma, although that is marvellous. And then the jewel will arise in the heap of rubbish. But a bodhisattva becomes a bodhisattva when bodhicitta arises in them. So now we're going to hear a couple of bits of Bhante about bodhicitta. And just to say, like all the larger quotes, I'll put up on Padlet, so you don't have to try and scribble them down or anything like that. So this is Bhante in the Bodhisattva ideal. The Bodhicitta is not a mental state, activity, or function at all. It is certainly not a thought that you or I could entertain. It is not even an act of will in the sense in which we understand the term. It is not one's personal will. The Bodhicitta represents the manifestation, even the eruption within us, of something transcendental. The emergence within our ordinary experience of something of a totally different nature. The arising of the Bodhicitta is a profound spiritual experience. It is not, however, a personal experience. It is not individual. There is only one Bodhicitta in which all individuals participate, or which individuals manifest to varying degrees. This means that the Bodhicitta is more likely to arise in a spiritual community, a situation of intense mutual spiritual friendship and encouragement. The Bodhicitta is supra-individual, but not collective. A rather tricky concept to get hold of. You're not wrong, Bhante. And then from Wisdom Beyond Words, the Bodhicitta is something transcendental, best described as a suprapersonal transcendental energy that manifests through the individual, although it is at the same time that individual's truest and deepest nature. It is in this sense that the Bodhicitta is a power. So that gives a bit of a flavour of where we are. Yes. So I feel like talking about bodhicitta, it's like we just come up against like a classic problem in the Buddhist tradition, which is that awakening and processes of awakening are beyond words and concepts and beyond the limited rational mind. And yet, how are we to communicate those? We have to use words and concepts and kind of go, look, it's like this. No, actually, it's a bit like that. No, it's like that. And all the words and concepts kind of need to be taken kind of poetically. It's like something is trying to be expressed about what it is to be an awakening being, which is all of us. Like what is it like? What is it like as this difference that we create between me in here and world out there? What is it like as that begins to dissolve? What is that experience? Because Bodhicitta is pointing to something that, to an extent, it will be in our experience. And to an extent, it will be beyond our experience. So if we listen to Bhante talking about Bodhicitta, and we just kind of go, oh, that's something, that's some weird super personal transcendental what's it, and it's over there, and it might happen to Tibetan lamas, but it's got, how does that relate to me? It's not in my experience. Actually, it probably is to an extent. And also, if we feel like that, we are limiting ourselves. Actually, I love that image about the blind person finding the jewel in heaps of rubbish. And it's just like, sometimes I feel like I'm just like heaps of rubbish, and yet somehow this jewel of the Dharma is manifesting in my life. Like, no way, how did that ever happen? So, like, actually, Bodhicitta can arise in all of us. It's like, don't limit yourself and think this is nothing to do with me. If you are practicing, it is to do with you. And we can think, oh yeah, well, I do relate to that. That is in my experience. And we probably will have had experiences where it can feel like that, like maybe the end of a puja where it just feels like an atmosphere has taken off in the shrine room. And sometimes it almost feels like the air is vibrating and, something is present that is beyond each individual. Or it might be you're on an intensive meditation retreat, and I don't know, you're doing the Brahma Viharas, and it feels like your heart opens and there isn't any sense of self and there isn't any sense of other. It's just like you just want the best for all that lives. And Bhante talks about how the faculty of faith has a transcendental tinge. So actually, for each of us, faith will be present in our experience. There will be, something in our heart minds that resonates with Bodhicitta, that resonates with the Dharma, that's meaning we have asked for ordination or we have become ordained, and we're pursuing that. And actually only faith, this sort of rational, intuitive and volitional part of ourselves, but it's like we can say, oh, it's my faith, but actually it's that thing where Bhante talks about faith as what is ultimate in us, resonating with what is ultimate in the universe. Actually, if that, that last quote, Bodhicitta is at the same time each individual's truest and deepest nature. So just by virtue of the fact that we are on this path seriously, there will be some level of Bodhicitta already arising, already present in our experience. And if we can recognize that, it will grow. On the other hand, if we think, oh yeah, Bodhicitta, that's in my experience, oh yeah, I know what that is. What happens is we can appropriate it and think, oh, it's mine, that's my faith, or that's my realization, or that's my whatever. And also we can limit that experience to what we have already known. And actually, whatever we have already known will be a tiny part of bodhicitta as this sort of dynamic process of awakening, kind of like beginning and flowering in each individual. So we need to both be able to relate to it and be able to realise that it is beyond us, and it's just going to keep on opening out. I mean, actually, I really quite like the definition that Subhuti gives in the 7 papers, where he talks about bodhicitta as a dynamic process. I think that really expresses it well. Bodhicitta as a dynamic process, referring to the stream of selfless mental states that arise on the basis of the dharmic kind of conditionality. So this bodhicitta is dharma niyama processes awakening in us, yet beyond us. And of course, one of Bhante's key insights was how bodhicitta is not separate from other ways of describing the deepening of practice. So it's the altruistic dimension of going for refuge. To the extent we are going for refuge, to that extent, bodhicitta will be arising within our psyches. So when we talk about bodhicitta being transcendental, it's one of these, like, you sort of throw these words around. Transcendental, what does that mean? And quite simply, what we're meaning with transcendental is where we are gradually stopping relating as here, there's a me here, fixed and solid, and I relate to a world out there that is fixed and solid, and mostly my relationship with that world is one of grasping. So I want to get the things that I want to pull them towards me, and that will make me safe and secure and happy. And I want to push away things that I don't want, and I keep them way, way over there somewhere. I don't want them to happen, and that will make me safe and happy. So when Bhante's talking about this eruption of a transcendental order of things, he's talking about this dissolution of this sort of mistaken interpretation of our experience. This mistake where we kind of think, oh yeah, there's me here and I can get happiness by grabbing stuff out there. So it's not that we're losing anything. It's just that we're dissolving a mistake in our perception. So how do we approach bodhicitta? How do we practice in relation to it, encourage bodhicitta to arise in us? So we've already mentioned poetry and myth and symbol and bodhisattvas, and I think that whole sort of non-conceptual aspect of practice, that's just so important. And I'm going to talk about another way of approaching bodhicitta, which is around paradox. So a paradox is, this is from an online dictionary, okay? A seemingly absurd or contradictory statement which, despite sound reasoning, leads to a conclusion that seems logically unacceptable or self-contradictory. Now, a lot of the time when trying to move into this transcendental territory or this kind of area where this distinction between self and other starts dissolving, we get into the area of paradox, because in a way it's like our limited minds that see things divided. it's like we sort of think, well, if this is true, that can't be true. But if that's true, that can't be true. We see things as contradictions. But actually, the paradox is trying to tell us something about the limitation of how we're currently thinking. So there's a lot of Bodhicitta paradoxes. We've just met some of them. It arises in the individual, but does not belong to them. It's suprapersonal, but not collective. It's expressed as dedicating oneself to enlightenment for the sake of all beings. But it arises as the realization dawns that in an ultimate sense there is no self and no beings. So this is the Bodhisattva dedicated to saving all beings and knowing that beings do not exist. That is a paradox. And it's trying to break us out of our common sense, like our assumptions about the world. Now, my dad is a research physicist, or he was before he retired, and he used to tell, it's like sometimes you grow up and then you realise that what your dad told you was really sensible. And he was a research physicist, and he used to say, if you are trying to explore something new, you need to ignore common sense. Common sense will tell you what you already know. Common sense will take you wrong. So we've got Niels Bohr, who's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, saying, the opposite of a true statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth can be another profound truth. I'll put these on Padlet, so it's like you really don't have to try and write it all down. And again, from this area of physics, in quantum physics, you've just got this idea where particles behave sometimes as a marble, like a particle or a billiard ball, and sometimes as a wave, like ripples on water. So this is Brian Cox, and he says, neither of these is absolutely correct, but you have to hold both pictures in your mind. So with this Bodhicitta example, you have to hold in your mind compassion for all beings, and at the same time, there are no beings. Brian Cox again, who doesn't talk about the Bodhicitta, strangely enough. When you hold together two necessary ideas, you come to a richer solution. This is called complementarity. And this is something they actually have to teach physics students at undergraduate level. So the classic description of how the Bodhicitta arises is that it arises out of the tension between wisdom and compassion. So the wisdom is seeing no beings exist, and the compassion is, and how can I abandon these beings? My practice has to include this. I have to, as I realise interconnectedness, how could it possibly make sense not to respond to other beings, not to respond to the world? How could it possibly make sense not to do that? So it can be quite uncomfortable to hold a paradox, because what we want to do is to understand it rationally. We want to make the concepts make sense. We want to go, oh yeah, this makes sense in common sense. And actually, quite often it doesn't. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to hold two opposing ideas together, two necessary ideas. So we're going to explore these two areas of wisdom and compassion that need to come together for the fullness of Bodhicitta. So the wisdom aspect, which can also be withdrawal, and I quite like thinking of it as letting go, wisdom as letting go. So you could say this is the aspect of practice which is more individual, practicing the Dharma as a personal path to awakening. Letting go of the world, seeing false refuges, seeing deeply that what is impermanent and insubstantial cannot give us true and deep satisfaction. And when we see that, actually we let go, we stop clinging. So you might just want to think, well, where does that show up in my life? And there will be like small and large ways. I think a very, very obvious example to me was, so when I met the Dharma, I was a really keen, in fact, obsessive rock climber. And it's like, that was my whole life, was like training and going and climbing mountains and then going and climbing the next mountain and doing some more training and going and climbing the next mountain. And it's like, there was something about that, and there was a sort of view under that as well, which was like, this will bring me deep and lasting satisfaction. And also there was something about, and this will keep me safe in the world. If I'm really fit, if my body's trained, if I'm tough, if I can do all this stuff, somehow it's like I was gonna be okay in the world. And then I met the Dharma, and then I realised that actually those things weren't going to mean that I was okay in the world necessarily. But it was more like, if instead of putting my safety and happiness in kind of like recurrently doing this activity, but instead I grew inner resilience, metta, awareness, actually no matter what then happened in my life, I'd be able to handle change and difficulty. Like no matter what happened, I would always have that sort of like as a sort of inner resource. So here's a wisdom quote. So this is from the final chapter of the Sutta Nipata, which is very, very poetic. I don't know that this bit is particularly, but anyway, Maitrisiddhi, stay on topic. Don't start talking about the Sutta Nipata. Okay, so this is a chap having come to see the Buddha, and there's a whole series of blokes coming to see the Buddha and asking these very passionate questions, and this is the Buddha answering one of them with this pith wisdom teaching, and he says, "In every direction there are things you know and recognize, above, below, around, and within. Leave them. Do not look to them for rest or relief. Do not let consciousness dwell on the products of existence, the things that come and go." So that's the wisdom aspect. And then we've got the compassion or engagement aspect. So if we're thinking of wisdom as letting go, we might think of the compassion or engagement as loving, letting go and loving. And so this is us seeing our connectedness to the world and all beings, seeing their suffering, and realizing actually how can we go off and be happy in some private corner, indifferent to the unnecessary pain and suffering in the world. So another bit from the Sutta Nipata. So this is a question asked by someone called Kappa, and then the Buddha's response. And he says, "Sir, there are people stuck midstream in the terror and the fear of the rush of the river of being. And death and decay overwhelm them. For their sake, sir, tell me where to find an island. Tell me where there is solid ground beyond the reach of all this pain. That's his heart question. He says, I have to practice for the sake of all beings. Tell me for the sake of all these beings. And the Buddha says, for the sake of those people stuck in the middle of the river of being, overwhelmed by death and decay, I will tell you where to find solid ground. So both these aspects are they're inherent in us. It's like we will be able to find both of those trends in our experience and in our engagement with practice. And we may find that we have an affinity more with one than with the other. So for some people, practice just isn't going to make sense unless it is directly in relation to the world. Whether that's, like a personal sphere, like I've got a friend at the moment whose child is dying of cancer. It's like, how can I respond to that? It might be wider concern, like, we've had a lot of Indian order members dying of COVID just recently. And it's, okay, so how can I respond to that situation in India where it's just so much worse than it is here? Or it might be how we respond to big issues in the world, whether that's poverty, racism, conflict, refugees, whatever it might be. But for other people, practice isn't going to make sense unless it's aimed beyond the world, at a freedom of mind and heart that no social change could conceive of. In the history of the world, how many different sorts of political systems, how much social change, how much desire for, this world to be a kinder place. And yet by itself, that doesn't do it. So sometimes it can feel as though wisdom and compassion, although, we'll experience them both in ourselves, sometimes it can feel that they are in conflict or even negating each other. And it's just very interesting, actually, when this shows up. So I'm just going to give an example, which is different responses to the current ecological crisis, to climate change and mass extinctions and sort of thing, which is just incredibly painful. So a wisdom perspective would say, yep, 3 lakshanas. Tick, yep, this looks like the 3 lakshanas. Suffering, impermanence and insubstantiality. This is the nature of conditioned existence. This is just how it is. This earth cycles through periods of life flowering and many, many forms and coming into being, and then periods of mass death and extinction. This is just a natural process. This whole planet too, it came into being and it will cease at some point. So it's like, well, we could call it an ecological crisis, or we could call it a natural process. We could call it a natural process of flow, of arising and ceasing in dependence on conditions. And what that sort of reflection does is it gives rise to equanimity. And actually I do get this sense from my yidams, when I meditate on my yidam, which is Maitrisiddhi, it's like I do just get this deep sense of peace and ease. like actually everything is just all right as it is. There's a deep emotional letting go and coming to terms with how things actually are. It's like stopping fighting reality. So that's a wisdom perspective, a letting go perspective. But then a compassion perspective would say, yes, but beings are suffering and beings are dying. And these different forms of life are so unique and so amazing and so precious, so beautiful. You know, beings are of value in themselves. I am alive like them, and you know, they want life, I want life. I want to live in a planet where like everything is flowering, where everything is valued. And if I can act in a way that is going to alleviate that suffering in any way, well, of course, I want to do that action. Why would I not want to help? And if I don't act out those values of compassion in the world, well, where is my Dharma life? That is, you know, completely going to be the heart of the Dharma life. And when I'm in touch with my yidams, actually it's like they're saying, oh yeah, climate change is fine, that's how it is. And they are also radiating this sense of love and compassion, you know, just like this sort of caring for beings that is beyond what my little mind can manage. So if we have just the wisdom perspective, it sounds like it's opposite. It sounds like it's contradicting the compassion perspective. This wisdom perspective, what do you mean everything's all right? That's cold, it's uncaring, you're indifferent. You know, encountering someone with a very strong compassion perspective, we might perceive that as them desperately trying to fix the world. Compulsive activity, probably ending up in a one-way trip to overwhelm. And if we, and we may think that person expressing that compassion perspective, it feels like the Dharma has been lost. And if our natural affinity is with the compassion perspective, if we think, no, I need to respond to the world, we'll hear a wisdom, oh dear, other way around. Sorry, I've got muddled with my opposites. Yeah, if we're a compassion person, we'll hear a wisdom perspective as a kind of withdrawal into a narrow self-obsession with us and our mental states. So a compassion person just thinks, you know, you're just using the Dharma as an excuse for passivity. You're ignoring our society and our world. And that person will also feel as though the Dharma has been lost. And yet both perspectives are essential. So we've got this image for enlightenment as the bird that flies on two wings. Just as a vulture soars and it needs two wings to fly, both compassion and wisdom are necessary. So Bhante says, how can there be compassion without understanding? Compassion means giving people what they need. And how can you give them what they need unless you understand what they need? And similarly, how can you have wisdom without compassion? How is it possible to see what people need and not want to give it to them? And what I love about this is that, in a way, how can we find that? How can we find those poles within us? How can we notice, when does compassion arise in us, like loving and just wanting things to be okay for, and acting out of that? And when do we need a wisdom perspective and bringing in, well, actually, these are the facts. This is how it is. How much am I just fighting reality? How much am I just doing aversion and not wanting suffering to exist, when in fact it does? And if we keep these two poles in tension, it's like we want both of them to be alive and vibrant in our practice. Then what arises out of that is this bodhicitta, where wisdom and compassion are united. We're in line with reality, we're not fighting it. And when we see actions we could take that would alleviate suffering, well, of course, we just want to do that. It's natural. It's not even us deciding we want to do it. It's just kind of like, that is the response. That's the response that we would want to make. And you might want to have a little think about, well, have you ever had any experiences which have felt a bit like that? Sometimes it can be in moments of crisis or a sudden bereavement in the family, where it's just like, this needs to be done. Okay, I'm going to do it. Now, what Bhante talks about the living synthesis. He says, as long as you think in conceptual terms, you will always have a contradiction. Therefore, the only real synthesis is not to be found in concepts at all, but in living experience. A final synthesis can only be in the life of the individual, for whom those concepts have meaning. Life transcends logic. It's as simple as that. Okay, I'll put that on Padlet. So that's the principle, this sort of holding together the paradox of wisdom and compassion and letting an alchemy happen in our minds. But then what practices might we undertake to allow this to happen? So the first approach, the first way of practicing would be developing bodhicitta. So it's like we think, I can do it. We can reflect, we can set up the conditions. So under this model, we might consciously choose to reflect first on the wisdom aspect, the three lakshanas. Here's this situation. How are the three lakshanas showing up in this situation? And then on the compassion aspect. And we care. We let our hearts care. And we might also consciously reflect on faith in the path, like a belief that we can become enlightened. Bodhicitta can arise in us. And these reflections are sort of classically encapsulated in Vasubandhu's 4 factors. And Bhante talks about them very accessibly in the Bodhisattva Ideal, if you're interested in that. It's not Tablet, it's Padlet. It's the online notice board, Eva. But we might sort of feel like, well, I keep practicing and I keep reflecting and I keep doing the metabhavana and I keep on trying to make the bodhicitta arise, and damn it just doesn't happen. So, if we start feeling a bit like that, then we might want to take a different approach. So another approach would be an approach of opening to bodhicitta. where we sort of imagine, we conceive of bodhicitta as a power or a force external to us, rather than something that we are trying to make happen. So this is a kind of surrender approach. I can't do it. I am a finite, conditioned being. You know, if I knew how to get enlightened, I'd have done it eons ago. And so the classic practice for this would be puja, or devotion. And this is a model of relationship. Here I am, a finite conditioned being, and I'm speaking my aspiration. I'm coming into relationship with this dynamic, enlightening force that has these qualities. We're aligning ourselves. And that is a very, very powerful practice. Bhante says, one needs a basis within one's own experience which is so positive that even though one is fully aware of other people's suffering and one is doing what one can to alleviate it, one is not overwhelmed by that suffering. So it's like, where do we find a basis in our experience which is so positive? And, you know, this is why when we get ordained, we have yidams. Can we find, you know, it's like, I don't have the capacity like that. I don't personally have that level of positivity, but I can relate to it outside of me. You know, Maitreya can hold that level of positivity for me, so overwhelm doesn't happen. But we might feel like, but I'm not really into puja and I just don't really get devotion and it's just not my thing. So there is a third method. And this would be allowing bodhicitta to emerge. So this is an immanence or an emergence model where it's like there's just a sense that we don't need to do anything. A sense that the qualities of enlightenment, this wisdom and compassion, they are within us. And they're just waiting to unfold when we give them space. So this practice looks like just sitting with, sitting alongside, breathing alongside our own experience and alongside suffering. We're just offering space and we're letting these deep wisdom and compassion qualities emerge from our depths. So this is like Bhante saying, bodhicitta is at the same time that individual's truest and deepest nature. And it does matter to practice in relation to bodhicitta because our practice is never just personal. Because this self-other divide, it's something we invent. So actually, like, our practice is always influencing the world and the world is always influencing us. And there's something about like holding these concepts that break us open, that break us out of a sense of limitation into something much bigger. And we don't have to make that happen. We can set up conditions, we can try and open to it, we can let ourselves stay in relation, and we can allow our deep qualities to manifest. This is the arising of the moon of the mind, the precious and sublime bodhicitta.